so far, we've looked at some aspects of a common culture and common civilization in this part of the world. And one of the things, obviously, that comes up are these tendencies and the concept of the other, let's say, as seen from the point of view of a Muslim supremacy and a Muslim superiority. Part of the accepted narrative was that the Ottoman Empire was very tolerant in its beginning, at least tolerant of other religious minorities and so on. But this is not upheld by the facts of its late history and its, so as you very well said. So we are sort of probing what exactly is it that creates these abhorrent situations, because you would agree that there's still an ongoing Christian persecution in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. And so it's a recurring theme, and it's a continuous theme. So my first question to you, did the 30-year genocide end in 1924, or is it, are we seeing trails of it again?
Well, in the book itself, I think we devote a few sentences to what happened to Greeks, for example, who had remained in Turkey, especially in Istanbul, over the following decades. And we point out that there were a series of pogroms in Turkey against the Greeks, which ultimately drove out almost all the Greeks during the 50s and later from the soil of Turkey. In the Middle East itself, basically we're talking about the Muslim Middle East, there is ongoing persecution of Christian minorities, Assyrians in northern Iraq, some Christians in Syria. There are attacks on Copts quite frequently in Egypt, and all of this is a part of a pattern in which Christians are persecuted by Muslims, and the Christian numbers diminish in the Arab Middle East, and this has been the situation since the 1920s, since what happened in Turkey. If you like, the Turkish episode, which we covered in the 30-year genocide, it was the major contribution to throwing out the Christians from the Middle East, but these have been followed by others over the decades in Iraq during the 30s against the Syrians and so on. And you see it also in the Palestinian territories. The number of Christians living in the West Bank today and in Gaza is much smaller than it was 50 years ago. The town of Bethlehem, which used to be a Christian town, is now mostly Muslim. And this is the pattern.
Why do you think this is? I mean, I understand some of the suggestions that had to do with the reaction in the period that you covered, political reasons, national security reasons, etc., etc. So, is it one to assume that Eastern Christianity is still related in some way to a Western threat? I mean, in the eyes of, in the interpretation of the Muslim street, not the fundamental. Is it? This is my other question, and I'll mix them together. Is it a particular interpretation of Islam that is behind this, or is it Orthodox Islam, let's say?
Well, this is, of course, things I've been criticized for saying, but my sense is that Islam is, especially in the Arab or Middle Eastern world, is an intolerant religion. It doesn't tolerate other religions. It wants to uproot the Jews from Palestine, Israel, and it wants to uproot and has been uprooting the Christians from the Middle East as I say, certainly since 1894. So a major thrust in this is Islam itself. It's not some Muslim extremists. There is intolerance built into Islam, stemming, if you like, from what the Quran says about the peoples of the book. In some, the sayings are ambivalent. In some places, the peoples of the book are praised, but it also says the Jews, for example, are a base people, killers of prophets and poisoners of prophets, and so on. And something similar applies to Christians. And this has been the Muslim past, the Muslim behavior since the 7th century, since the rise of Islam, but in staggered, not organized, not systematic fashion. So that's one element. There are of course other elements in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire. I think Muslims sincerely saw the Christians as potential threats, as potential, if not actual rebels, who might make common cause with the Christian empires outside the Ottoman Empire against the Ottoman Empire. So they, at least they felt that, whether that was completely realistic or just paranoia, but this is how they felt about their Christians, the Greek Christians, the Armenian Christians, and the Syrian Christians. Since then, I don't think there is any real basis for Muslim feelings that the Christians, who are so insignificant in such small numbers in Iraq, in Syria, etc., I don't think there's any real basis for believing that they are an internal threat, that they threaten Islamic supremacy in these states. But nonetheless, there is an intolerance which is inbuilt, which is not connected to a sense of threat.
Professor, Western politicians, and both in the United States and in Europe, go to great lengths to suggest that there's a moderate Islam, at least in Europe, or that they are in touch with advocates of a moderate Islam. Now, is this moderate Islam a very small minority? Is it something that could grow? Is it something that we could look for the future in the East, in the Middle East, in our part of the world, or is it just a dream?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. You have to be better aware of the streams of thinking and the feeling, etc., among Muslim communities in the West, and I haven't been following this. There does seem to be some sort of struggle between moderate Islam and extremist Islam in Western Muslim communities. How real this moderate, or how popular this moderate Islam is, I don't know. Whether all these sheikhs or imams, etc., who show up at funerals of Christians murdered by extremist Muslims and say this isn't us, this is some sort of a mad extremist, etc. I don't know how sincere they are. I would be sort of suspicious of their sincerity in general. But there probably are moderate Muslims out there in the Western Muslim communities who would like to moderate Islam, but I don't know how powerful they are. And usually the trend seems to be they give in when it comes to the real things. They give in to the extremists because they themselves are afraid of being killed or persecuted by their more extreme brothers in religion.
You know, if you look at the older Palestinian aristocratic leadership, the Husseinis, the Khalidis, the Nusayris, they all sent their children to Christian schools. So Hiba Husseini went to a Christian school, and Sari Nusayri went to a Christian school, and Faisal, all of them. So it is a little bit a matter also of the time they grew up, and it's a matter of the people they are. There's a strong, you have the Nashashibis in Israel who try to push what they call the Wasatiyah, the moderate Islam. My sense is that you have different realities.
Yeah.
You have different groups, different realities, and definitely I would not make the mistake to try to to say that all Muslims are Christian haters and Jewish haters.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say they're all Christian.
Yeah, no,
I would cast some doubt on the meaning of this phenomenon you point to, that some of the, I don't think it's all, but some of the notable families in Jerusalem and in the West Bank sent their kids, the Muslims, sent their kids to Christian schools, and I would suggest they sent them there because the Christian schools were good and Muslim schools were awful.
Fair enough, but it means that they were not
a matter of tolerance so much as getting a decent education for their kids so that they could go on to Cambridge and Oxford and their calls in France.
Yeah, but it means that if you want to have a Western education and if you have a pro-Western view, then there is more. Then the end, one or the other are the enemies. They hate each other and they fight each other and actually they kill each other. Whereby the fundamentalists kill the others less than the other way around.
Yes.
And you had also, and I also had another thing, you had American policy in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where they would give tremendous support to the very radicals. And it made sense for Saudi Arabia to put up schools, Islamic schools everywhere, which teaching militant Islam and very dangerous Islam. And Osama Laden is an outcome of it. And the question that I have, and this relates to what you're saying, if there is a way to change the tendency, if this is inherent in Islam, you can give a lot of examples why this lack of tolerance is part of Islam. You read the Quran, there are many parts to it. Or if there is a way to change it, and how do you deal with it? Well, I don't have the answer, I have the question.
Well, I think the simple answer to that is you can't change it by edict from above. And I think it's a matter of many generations of education to uproot this intolerance and to teach tolerance and let it sink into a people. And it's not that simple to do. And as I say, it'll probably take generations upon generations if there is a will and an efficient method of doing this, inculcating tolerance. I fear that we don't really have that much time, and that intolerant Islam has gained the upper hand in the Middle East and probably will gain the upper hand in the Muslim communities in France, Britain, and the West in general. The only exception, incidentally, to that is probably Muslims in America. And there are something like 5 or more million Muslims in America, maybe 7 million is the number. But in America, because they are such a small minority, they somehow, the second generation turns into a proper Americans, liberal, democratic, and so on, through the school system. And this doesn't seem to happen in Western Europe, where the kids go to Islamic schools, to Muslim schools.
There are many things the government can do and actually is doing. And the Muslim leadership is moderate. You have the Muslim youth in Austria protesting against right-wing anti-Semitism, against the attacks on a Holocaust memorial. And the Muslim youth were standing there for 2 days in protest against the right-wing protests. So you have this kind of thing. How much this represents a bottom-up group, and how much this represents the more general feeling about the Muslim community, I have no idea, and I don't know how much it can be sustained. But it is a model that may be used elsewhere to create a similar moderating effect. The moment if the state says we love you all and we don't want to interfere, and multiculturalism and Islamophobia is terrible, then you get the most extreme guys.
Yeah.
Does it also have to do with the whether Muslims are in a minority or a majority or a significant minority, and of course whether they are allowed to in some ways ghettoize their living arrangements. I think perhaps one question, Professor, that I know that you've been involved with the Palestinian issue quite a bit.
My favorite issue.
Sorry?
I'm just joking. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. No. My question is simple in the sense that under what circumstances, if there were to be a single Israeli, a single Israel, let's say, under what circumstances would a rising Muslim minority, if not majority at some point, accept a secular state or a non-Muslim state? I mean, it seems to me as an outsider, and I'm sorry to intrude on a subject that I know is very important. It seems to me that it would be a time bomb almost for Israel if it would remain as a single, the single state solution, let's say, would seem like a time bomb. What is your view?
Well, that's a whole new swamp. The problem is there's a number of problems. One of them is that Islam is very strong among the Palestinians, among Israel's Arab citizens who call themselves also Palestinians today, but is certainly in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In a free election, everybody predicts the Hamas would win both in Gaza and the West Bank, maybe even in East Jerusalem. So Islam is very strong there, partly because Islam seems to represent the struggle against the Jews, against the Jewish occupation of Arabs and dominance over the Arabs. That's how most Arabs in the territories view Islam. The problem for Israelis, I think, is how, and I'm speaking as I suppose a sort of a liberal Israeli, is how one can extricate Israel from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and revert to a two-state solution, to reach a two-state solution in which the Arabs would have a state of their own based on the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and perhaps in confederation with Jordan, which that's the only possible two-state solution which one could have. The problem is if you leave these territories and the Hamas takes over in them, then you end up with the people, the Hamas in the West Bank, rocketing a Jewish Jerusalem, rocketing Tel Aviv, as they have done around the Gaza Strip, from the Gaza Strip. So even liberal Israelis don't know how to solve this problem. A one-state solution doesn't actually exist. It would simply be a state of anarchy. In other words, if Israel absorbed all the Arabs in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip into its own territory as part of a state of Israel, that state would have more or less an equal number of Jews and Arabs in it. The Israelis would not want to give the Arabs the vote, the Arabs of the occupied territories the vote, because if they did, they would lose the majority in their Knesset, in their cabinet, in their state. On the other hand, to continue to rule over, to control over these Arab populations means you would have an apartheid state. At the moment, Israel manages by simply saying, this is occupied territory, it's not part of Israel, so we don't have to give them citizenship. But if it becomes part of Israel, then you have to give them citizenship, or you're managing an apartheid state, and that's a problem. A real question exists, and I don't really know the answer to it, is about the Arabs inside the state of Israel, the citizens of Israel who are Arabs, who now mostly call themselves Palestinians. How tolerant are they towards the Christians in their midst? In other words, about 10% or maybe a little more of the Israeli Arabs are Christians, 90 or 80% are Muslims. How tolerant are these Muslims of these Christians? And I don't really know the answer to that. But since they live in a Jewish state run by a Jewish government with Jewish army, Jewish police, etc., they don't unleash pogroms against Christians. But whether that actually represents their real feelings about the Christians, I don't know.
Yeah, it's my concern wasn't specifically on the Christians in this context, but again, going back to this interim solution, let's say, of ruling these of Israel ruling these areas as non-Israeli territory. Again, it's not indefinitely. It's not something that could be sustained indefinitely. Or is
this is what we said 40 years ago and 30 years ago and 20 years ago, and it's been happening. This has been the situation since 1967, which is now 50-something years, in which we are administering or controlling these territories and these populations without giving them citizenship and without a horizon in which we will be able to get out of there, or freedom, if you like. In other words, a temporary situation has turned into something which nobody would have believed in 1967, 68 could continue for 5 decades, and that has been the situation.
Do you see
what I'm saying is this situation could continue for another 50 years. The world is going to force Israel, apparently, to get out of there. The Arabs are incapable of forcing Israel to get out of there. The Israeli left is incapable of finding a solution which will secure Israel's defensibility. It's a really, I think I see it as sort of as a hopeless situation.
Do you see it, in quotes, occupation turning into something like a mandate? Let's say that Israel becomes responsible for these areas and these people in more ways than just occupying them.
What do you think?
This would be
according to international law, we are responsible.
Yeah.
According to international law, we are responsible for that.
Yes, but in a mandate kind of a way, in a UN mandate type of situation.
It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. I'm less pessimistic as Benny, and I am. We're both historians. I believe that if I compare the situation not with 67, but with 91, 92. We have gone a long way in the right direction with a lot of setbacks. And the obstacles are still tremendous. But we, and if we overcome, the perception is exactly as Benny says. The perception is we are stuck. There's no other way. We can't get out. We can't get in. We're stuck with it. I don't believe that this is true. I believe that we started in Camp David with the wrong paradigm, a paradigm which was a disaster and couldn't have worked. We got the Oslo Accords as the first step of the paradigm. And then I personally suggested in 91 to change it and worked with an English ambassador, and we didn't work at all. But the logic is, the inbuilt logic of the conflict is that we need global support and regional cooperation and normalization with the region in order to be able to move ahead on the Palestinian level. And we are closer to that any time than before. And there's a lot of things one can do in Palestinian state building. You don't negotiate an agreement before you create a state. The assumption that you create a state by signing a piece of paper has been an outrageous idea. And the idea that you can reach end of conflict on all issues has been simply that it's detached from reality. But that you know that you have to first to create the basic functioning of a state on the ground. And there are many things we can do, and this government could do quite a lot. There are serious obstacles, I know. But if you do Palestinian state building on the ground, you build the infrastructure of electricity, of water, with territorial impact, of course. and you create, you turn the dependence, enormous dependence they have on us into an interdependent relationship. And there's some things in doing. It is in first move, but you need the region in order to cooperate. The only give and take on the Israeli-Palestinian line is not, the Palestinians need to get things from us, and we need to get things from the global community and from the world. And it's not why you cannot bilaterally really negotiate without the support from the outside. The world has asked to do this bilaterally. We've been stupid enough to try. And there is a way forward. If we will take this way, I don't know. I can tell you there's so much misunderstanding and so much internal fights and so much think that it can go very wrong. And Benny Morris will be absolutely right when he says this is the world stay and we're in a mess. But not that there's no way out. There is a very clear way out. And the question is, how do you work for it and how do you make it happen? I believe that we speak to the Europeans and we come a better understanding. If you get the Ami Ayalon concept on fighting terror, and you get the need for soft power activities more, and you have a better understanding on the security issues, then there's much that can be done. And then we have rational and irrational fears, and the rational fears are very down to earth, and the irrational fears are the outcome of a history of 2,600 years that you can't simply ignore. And so we have to overcome part of it or deal with it. And so the answer is Muslim radicalism. You know, it's Iran, like Dr. Surkov told us in a meeting, Iran does us a favor. It's partly true. The question, does it as a favor, does it help to threaten us? And both is true. And the question is, how do you play?
Can I pick up on what you just said, the Islamic radicalization? Because the way that I understood Israeli policy was that normalization of Israeli relations with the Arab countries preceded the solution. Now, with the Abraham Accords, we're on a track of normalization. But doesn't that concept depend on a moderate Islam coming to the fore that would look at Israel and its right to exist in a positive light? Dr. Morris, you view, and I agree with you, that there's, and I think Yair also, that there's a rise in Islamic radicalization rather than Islamic moderation. So, you may have agreements with the states, but if the mood on the street in most of these Arab countries is reactionary, then we're just treading water. It's, the dilemma of what to do with the Palestinians still remains. So
yeah, look, the Islamic parties, meaning essentially the Hamas, but also the Islamic Jihad, totally reject any compromise with the Israelis, totally reject the idea of a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. All of Palestine is Islamic holy territory and belongs to Islam and the Palestinians. That's how they see it. And they represent, unfortunately, as I said, the majority Arab opinion at the moment, certainly in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and maybe also in East Jerusalem. The problem is that Islamic rejectionism, Arab rejectionism of Israel, has in some ways changed Israeli public opinion. Jewish Israeli public opinion was by and large in 1937, in 1947, in the year 2000, was by and large favorable to the idea of a two-state solution. In other words, partitioning Palestine, historic Palestine, into two states, the Israel and an Arab state. But Arab rejectionism, including, of course, terrorism, which is one of its aspects, one of its manifestations, is among the reasons for Israelis moving towards the right, which is why people like Benjamin Netanyahu have been winning elections, or at least right-wing parties symbolized by Netanyahu have been winning elections even now. The most recent election in which they managed to throw out Netanyahu, but there is a vast majority of Jewish Israelis supporting right-wing parties, except some of them didn't like Netanyahu, and that's how he got into this unusual coalition. And this movement to the right is, as I say, partly fueled by Arab rejectionism of a Jewish state since the 30s. And I don't see that diminishing, especially in the light of the demography of Israel, of Jewish Israel. The demography in Israel has also added to this by increasing the number of religious Jews as opposed to secular Jews, increasing the number of Oriental Jews as opposed to Ashkenazi Western-thinking Jews. And this has helped to sustain right-wing governments and right-wing thinking among Israelis, and will continue to do so. That's why this election and its result is such a fluke, that whereas 60-70% of Israeli Jews are right-wing, and their numbers is constantly growing, they didn't win the election in the sense that there's a sort of a multi-party coalition at the moment. But it's not representative of anything, not representative of the Israeli Jewish public. But as I say, before that, around that, in front of that, is Arab rejectionism, which is still quite strong. Arabs in Palestine, in Israel as well, but also in the West Bank and Gaza, do not understand why there is a Jewish state here, or why the world, international community, has accepted the establishment of a Jewish state here on land which they regard as theirs. They can't understand why Russian Jews come here and are become citizens of Israel, and while Arabs are second-class citizens as they see it, and in some ways are second-class citizens.
Yeah. Is there any parallels to be drawn with the creation of Lebanon close to 100 years ago? Because there, the Christians started by being a majority, and with certain decisions that were made, Greater Lebanon rather than smaller Lebanon, etc., we have a situation today where I think it would be abhorrent, I think, for any Israeli 100 years from now to find themselves in the same situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's an historical parallel here. The Christians in Lebanon, who were given a small state by the French around 1920, or what was seen to be, would become a Christian state, pushed to enlarge Lebanon by adding the Bekaa and southern Lebanon to the state, meaning adding many more Shias and Shiites, especially, to the state, meaning more Muslims to the state, and thus created essentially a Muslim majority state rather than the Christian majority state. And the Israelis did something very similar at the end of the 1948 war, when they negotiated armistice agreements with Jordan, our neighbor. Israel, because it wanted more strategic depth, they demanded that Jordan pass to Israel a whole strip of territory, which is today called the Little Triangle, from Wadi Ara down to Kafr Qasim, with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Arabs living there. Israel said, we want this territory, and maybe Israeli leaders at the time hoped that the Arabs from these villages, which now turned into cities, would vanish, but they didn't vanish, they stayed, thus increasing the Arab population in Israel. Israel did exactly the same stupid thing that the Christians did in Lebanon. Quite awful.
But was in this debatable, but the suggestion that the situation in Lebanon was a result of the famine that was created, and therefore a larger Lebanon would be
more sustainable economically. Yeah, this was one of the arguments at the time. Yeah. Yeah.
But it was the same in Israel. No, it was
Here there was no economic situation. It was strategic. They wanted a deeper Israel because from the West Bank to the Mediterranean it was about 10 miles. And Israel said, we can't have 10 miles which can be cut by an armored division in 10 minutes, cutting the country in half. So he must have greater territorial depth, and they ended up with 15 or 20 miles. But that meant incorporating hundreds of thousands of Arabs, or what turned out to be hundreds of thousands of Arabs into Israel's citizenry. And this was a problem. Countries do that, peoples do this, and then not understanding what it means, and eventually they are stabbing themselves in the back.
We, Benny and me don't fully see, we see reality close but not identical. I think it is a little bit more complicated than many shows. Also, this is the common knowledge. If you look at the Israeli side, the Israeli religious people who are politically very strong also would say God has given us all the country. Now, from my point of view, and there are a lot of people working on it, this offers an opportunity. And the opportunity means, okay, you cannot ask to give up total claim for the area, neither the one side nor the other, but there are many understandings that you can reach also according to Islamic law and also to Jewish law. And you've got people working on it. You've got very, very, very strong groups headed by Ofer Salzberg, headed by Rabbi Melchior, headed by Roy Ravitsky, headed by Alec Isaacs, and you have groups that are working on it, and they've got strong Muslim participants. You have today in the coalition, in the Israeli coalition, you have a Muslim party which clearly accepts the state of Israel and being part of the state of Israel.
I'm not sure that's true.
Okay, we made
they're in the coalition to gain things for the Arab population. Whether they accept Israel's legitimacy, I doubt it.
Okay, we may differ on that.
We differ.
I don't think that most Israeli Arabs, what does it mean to accept the legitimacy? They want to work and cooperate with Israel. And they're working on cooperating with Israel in many, many ways. If in their minds they want to destroy us, in their minds, most Israelis want to kick the Palestinians out of everywhere.
I don't think that symmetry is correct. I don't think most Israelis want to kick out the Palestinians. I think most Israelis, at least in the past, wanted to divide the country into two states, not to kick out the Palestinians. I do think most Palestinians would like the Israeli Jews to vanish. There's no symmetry there, in my view.
In the end, I tell you my reaction. We differ on quite on some things, which is obviously most legitimate. But the logic, the political logic coming from it is very simple. The logic is that Israel needs to work to build supportive coalitions. The idea that we can be alone against everyone is outrageous. And we have today, we have an alliance, we have a dwindling alliance relationship with the United States that may go away or may at least be far more problematic than it is today or than it was some time ago. And we need to have an understanding with the Egyptians, definitely with Egyptians and Jordanians and the Arab part of the world, with the Europeans. And we're working on working with the Europeans. I can tell you what Rabin said, and this is a quote from Rabin, word by word, in a meeting he had with the rabbinical leadership. Rabin would drive three circles on a paper, which were geographic circles. He would say, the inner circle is the West Bank and Gaza, and I'm Minister of Defense at that time, but I don't care about that. That's the task of Shabak, of IDF, of the Central and the Southern Command and the Northern Command to take care of that. There's a second circle. This is Lebanon and Jordan and Syria and Egypt. And I, as Minister of Defense, have to work with them in cooperation. And if this can be United Arab Emirates, it could be wider. And there's a third circle, which is Iran, and this is other places where we don't have full possibility. And we need the cooperation of the United States and other third powers. And in order to let me work in Jordan and with these in Jordan and in Egypt and when these peoples and build some kind of alliance relations, which we have today. And in order to let the third parties work against the threats that we have from the outer circle, we have to make certain concessions on the Palestinian level. And this was true this is a dialogue we had in 1990. This was true in 1990, this is true today. And the question whether they will in their heart continue to hate us or they will in their heart not continue to hate us is not relevant.
No, it is relevant. It's very relevant.
For an historical in the mind. But as the political strategic position, it doesn't mean that we don't have to work and see if we can do as much as we can.
Well, what they have in their hearts is more important than Rabin's circles.
I'm sorry?
What I think. What they have in their hearts is more important than Rabin's theoretical circles.
In the end, it's a matter of power. In the end, it's a matter of power. You know, power in the end.
I've got to go. I've got family here who've come. Is there anything you would like to tell us about what we should be doing, Dr. Pelaghias?
I'm sorry.
Well, I just, as a last point, our hope would be a sort of a development of an Eastern Mediterranean commonwealth, let's say, in the future sometime. Do you think that's a pipe dream, or could it? Is there a possibility of that? And we can finish if you'd like.
Okay. As long as nation states exist and the world is divided at the moment into nation states, this is sort of a pipe dream, yes. But maybe in the future it will work. And maybe if we have more Yair Hirschfeld, it will work.
Professor, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.